Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Telling the American Story with the U.S. Census, Teaching with Real Data, which is sponsored by Social Explorer. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations offer opportunities for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you should see a Q&A panel and a chat panel. If you don't, you can click the button that's trying hard to look like a dialog cloud on the bottom of your screen. And if you can't find the Q&A, there are 3 little dots in that same row of buttons. If you click those, it will open up a menu that will allow you to open up the Q&A. So please do use the Q&A panel to submit questions for our speaker, Rebecca, today throughout the presentation. We'll answer as many as we have time for at the end, so please do send them in throughout, and if we don't have an opportunity to get to your question today, we will make sure to follow up with you via email. All right, and if you are wondering what the chat's for, that's for messaging me if you have any technical issues. So if you do, we'll deal with that in the chat box. Today, we're using the hashtag ACRLChoiceWebinars, so if you've got another screen handy, shout out to us. We're at choice_reviews on Twitter. All right, and with that, we are ready to hand it over to Jeff Hahn from Social Explorer. So feel free to take it away, Jeff.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Hahn. I'm the Director of Academic Library Sales for Social Explorer. And thank you for joining us today. This is Social Explorer's first year as a standalone company. For the past 7 years, our award-winning tools were sold by Oxford University Press. We are now on our own, and our new webinar partnership of choice is very important to us. So welcome to the American Census, Teaching with Real Data. With the Census in the news daily, this is a timely and stimulating webinar for all data, business, and social science librarians. Social Explorer is one of the leading data visualization and mapping tools for research libraries, and we're proud to offer this webinar focused on data change over time and how this change tells the American story. Social Explorer is currently used by over 350 research libraries across the United States. So we are very proud and excited to be working with Rebecca Hyde on this webinar. Rebecca is an associate professor, research and instructor librarian at St. Louis University. Rebecca has spent nearly 20 years working in federal depository libraries and exploring the secret life of the U.S. Census. She works extensively with students and researchers to help them fully utilize the power of census data for historical and current population analysis. Before joining the faculty at St. Louis University, Rebecca worked at the University of California, San Diego, and Northwestern University. And now I'd like to turn it over to Rebecca. So Rebecca, take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jeff. And hello, everyone. Today I'm going to share with you just a little bit about how you can use Social Explorer as a tool to make census data, current and historical, more accessible, and a little bit about how I use it with students to get them excited about the prospect of using census and American Community Survey data. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry, having trouble forwarding the slides. So before I really dive in, I want to give you a quick overview of what I'll talk about today and what you can expect. I know this might be a bit of a mixed audience with different degrees of experience with the census and with Social Explorer, so I'm going to try not to assume too much knowledge of either. But I will assume that because you're listening, you have at least an idea of why the census is important and why you might want as many people as possible to have access. So I'll give a very short overview of why the census is so awesome, who uses the census with a focus on the academic environment, and why you might choose to use Social Explorer when teaching students and researchers about the census. Then I'll focus much of the presentation on examples of how I use and encourage students to use Social Explorer, from the big picture to the personal, and then we'll end with a short live demo of Social Explorer where we'll walk through some of the features with a focus on what's new and what I'm really excited about. If you're looking for data about the U.S. population, about how we live, where we live, what we look like, where we're from, there's no better data than the decennial census in the American Community Survey. It gives us the opportunity to see how we've changed as a country and a society over time. Even the questions asked reflect what is important to us. The current data is essential to the working of our government and the functioning of our democracy, and the historical data shows us where we've been and how policies and the forces of change, both at the macro and micro level, have shaped our lives, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. The data can't give us a complete picture of what the country looked like. What was asked shows what those in power believe to be important, and so it reveals our racism and our prejudice in both what is included and what is not. But it is still the most complete data we have on the population as a whole. And both of those points are really important to emphasize to students so that they know the limitations of the data they're using. Social Explorer helps get this data into the hands of as many people and researchers in as many different disciplines as possible. It opens up the data in a form that makes visualizing, mapping, and comparing over time exceptionally easy, even for those with no GIS experience. We've probably all experienced the power of seeing data visualized or mapped in a way that allows us to quickly see connections that would take a very long time, or that we might never see if we were only looking at numbers in a table. Expertise in GIS and in-depth knowledge of census and American Community Survey data ideally shouldn't be barriers for students and researchers to make those kinds of connections. Using this data, being able to visualize it, can inform research in so many different corners and can help shape our understanding of what has happened in new ways that allow us, hopefully, to make better decisions in the future. And the more students who are graduating with the data literacy skills they gain from doing those things, the better data-driven decisions they'll be making in their lives in the workplace, even if they're not using census data. So who uses it? Sharing census and community survey data with students gets me really excited, and I'm lucky enough to have multiple classes every year where faculty invite me to spend the entire class just talking about census data. But there's so many other classes and students I speak with who also greatly benefit from being able to use and visually explore census data. This is a visual representation of the disciplines I use Census data and Social Explorer with here at SLU, but honestly, it could be anyone. And I've used it with everyone from first-year undergrads to PhD students to faculty researchers, and in disciplines ranging from history and education to political science, public health, and social work. In addition to classes and students, I've also used it with alums who are now working for local nonprofits trying to show their significance and impact in the community. Social Explorer allows me to sneak in a discussion of the census along with other library resources and get students excited about it without having to convince faculty to give up an entire period just for the census. It also allows students to build important data literacy skills in a way that feels relevant to their studies and interests. So while there's a lot more to Social Explorer, I'll be focusing my examples today on what I use, which is primarily the U.S. Census data products, mostly from the 20th and 21st centuries. I'll be sharing just a handful of examples of the kinds of things you can do, either as a classroom demo to easily show the power of census data, or things that you might need to help students accomplish. All of the examples I'm sharing today are either things I've actually used in the classroom or the kind of thing I've helped students do. I've switched up some of the geographies and generalized some of the examples so that you don't have to look at St. Louis the whole time, but hopefully these examples will give you an idea of the power of Social Explorer backed by census data and help spark some new ideas about things that you might try. So I love using Social Explorer for visualizing patterns and trends over time. Students can use it to find patterns, decide what to study, and you can help students better understand trends that they're already reading about in class. I do a lot of co-teaching with our history librarian, and most of the history students don't have data analysis on their list of important things to do or learn. And I think there's a tendency to think of mapping with census data as something people do with current data, probably because GIS and data analysis are not as often taught in the humanities. But it can be a really powerful tool for students to explore major trends and to focus in on specific places impacted by those trends. I like to introduce Social Explorer to students in history as a way for them to better understand large patterns and trends and population movements. I recently used this example in a class on the American West, where one of the students was studying westward migration from St. Louis after the cholera epidemic in the 1850s. Excuse me. The map shows county-level population density with 1850 on the left and 1870 on the right. This isn't likely to be a student's major primary source for a topic like this, and like anything, it's limited by the scope of the data. You can see where the U.S. was actually counting as the U.S. at that point, so there's not data on all of what is now the U.S., but it can still give valuable insights for a history student looking at the reasons and timing behind the westward migration of the population. Zooming in closer, we can really see how that county-level population increased and expands out from St. Louis between 1850 and 1870, and even concentrates in St. Louis as people come and stay on their way west. The student in question may have otherwise come across some general population figures in their research, but even if they don't actually use the numbers here, seeing this change visually can help with context and understanding of other primary sources. You can use this comparison map feature to look at the big picture of the population and visualize major trends that help students identify where they should take a closer look. Thinking about another major population shift, the Great Migration in the early to mid 20th century, when many African Americans migrated north. I think this is a great example of using census data as the start of a conversation rather than the end of it. So why did people leave certain counties, more people leave certain counties than others, and how do things change in northern cities in the areas where larger African American populations settle? Do these trends continue past the time generally identified as the Great Migration? We're looking here at county level numbers for the Black population in 1910 on the left and 1970 on the right. A lot of the questions students might identify looking at images like this may not need or use additional census data to answer. But even in the identification of topics, it can be a really powerful tool, and it can also help hone in on areas of deeper interest. In this case, the student might decide to look more in depth at Chicago as a northern city that experienced a great population shift during this period. And for the years that census tracts are available, they can see exactly where the African American population settled and grew, which can lead to many different research questions and even help students decide what neighborhood or area of the city they want to focus their research on going forward. Showing examples like this in class will help prompt students to think about how data can help them see the big picture and how they might use data in their research. This is also a great example of how someone might use Social Explorer to identify patterns and data of interest, even if what they really want is to download data and create their own geographic analysis. You can download data from Social Explorer for this purpose, but I also often refer people in this situation to the National Historical Geographic Information System, or NHGIS, which has the geographic boundary files and data files that make up the back end of the historical piece of Social Explorer. These are freely available and a great option if you have a researcher who is intent on doing their own mapping or wants to do some more intense analysis with the historical data. So this brings me to one of the most common things I help students with and using census data with, and that is examining neighborhood change over time. This is a really popular assignment here at SLU in American Studies, Urban Planning, and for our Urban Poverty Studies minor. It can be tricky because you can only go back so far examining neighborhood data, usually 1940, occasionally 1930, and for many places not until later were census tracts available. So sometimes we can't quite get what we want, and this can involve disappointment, but I also think it's an important lesson in the limitations of past data. A great example of this is looking at a place like Harlem, where we know there was a large and vibrant community of African Americans around the turn of the century, but in summary data of the census, it's just not possible to see. We only have the county or city level data. For some places and years, we can get block level data in the census volumes, and we can always turn to the manuscript census. But for places less widely studied than Harlem, there's not really an easy way for novices to get information at a neighborhood level so early. But it's important for students to know that as well as what they can get. So looking at when the census tract data is available, starting in 1940 for New York and then moving through to 1970, we can see a big change both in the neighborhood and the surrounding area. Flip back and forth a little bit so you can see that change. And then if we go forward to 2017, we can see there's been a decline in the African American population in this area, which can lead to questions about what that means for the preservation of history in Harlem and even where new cultural centers might arise. And of course, students can really dig into other variables too to see what other changes are happening in this area over time. So actually identifying those boundaries is always the first basic step with students doing this kind of work. And as you probably know, census tracts and even census block groups often don't quite match up with the areas people want to study in real life. So the first step is to identify their preferred street boundaries, maybe based on official city neighborhood maps or historical traditional boundaries or even unofficial but commonly referred to boundaries. In this example, the Barrio Logan neighborhood in San Diego is interesting for a variety of reasons. It has long been a Mexican-American enclave and was one of many neighborhoods across the country overrun and divided by highways built in the mid-20th century. So there's probably a neighborhood in your community much that has that in common with Barrio Logan. Barrio Logan has the added distinction of being home to a naval shipyard, which has all kinds of environmental effects, but also means that the naval population is something to keep in mind, which is likely to be very different from the neighborhood as a whole. If we look at the official city of San Diego boundary for this neighborhood, they've already taken the naval base into account, which the boundary for Barrio Logan that we're seeing in Social Explorer includes that naval base. But in the official map, we can see that it's been cut out and they're defining Barrio Logan as just that slice that goes between the highway and the naval base. So usually students are going to try to decide whether or not to use census tracts that are partially inside and partially outside of a neighborhood. So if any of you remember or are still doing this kind of exercise using print maps or Census Bureau PDFs, you know this is a big step up. And we can use Social Explorer to identify the best boundaries based on census geography by comparing variable data for various years to easily decide whether census tracts should be included or not based on how much of them are included in the boundaries that students have set and how representative of the populations they're studying. And this Barrio Logan example is certainly very extreme, but it really gives an example of if a student was defining the boundaries of Barrio Logan in the way that it's defined in this map, then they would really get a different numbers on the population than really the neighborhood that they're focusing on. One of the nice features in Social Explorer is the ability to search on and add annotation based on various geography. So that includes zip codes, cities, and some neighborhoods. So you can see that feature here, and we also saw that in the Harlem example. And even when they aren't available for your area, it's easy to add, use the polygon annotation feature to draw on the boundaries you'd like to use. And I'll point out where that feature is when we do the live demo in a bit. So the examples we've talked about so far are probably more theoretical and academic from the student's perspective. For a lot of students, connecting the theories they're learning about with the data they're seeing and then applying that to the real world they're living in can take really a jump in thinking. And one of the ways to help them do that is to use examples that are both hyperlocal and relevant to the context of the class. So the example I'm going to share with you, I most recently used in an urban politics class where housing policy was a major part of the class and a research interest for a number of students. So in this slide, we're looking at median housing prices in St. Louis by census tract. This is really dramatic in St. Louis in particular because of the segregation and inequity in the city. What's commonly called the Del Mar divide can be starkly seen in the mapping of a variety of census labels, whether it's housing value like this, or income or race. And you can also really see the dividing line between Missouri and Illinois, where the Mississippi River goes around the city. Students are expecting to see something like this. They know they'll see it, but it's still striking to see a clear visual. But also for most of our students here at SLU, it's not actually personal. If they're from St. Louis, most of our students are from the whiter, richer side of this line. And even any real world experience they have with this difference is probably tied to their academics or maybe a service project through SLU. However, if we look at this same data, adding in a comparison of a comparison from a few years early, looking at 2014 compared to the 2017 data. And I can highlight for them a specific census tract near SLU. Otherwise, this looks like a pretty subtle change. But there's this one census tract close to SLU that looks very different. And I can ask the question, what's going on here? And does anyone know where this is exactly? What might be happening? Sometimes someone knows, they can tell from this map. Other times I have to mention that this census tract is the home of the Grove neighborhood, which is very close to SLU, and it's also home to the Urban Chestnut Beer Hall, which opened in 2014. The neighborhood was already being slowly revitalized, but slow was the operative word until Urban Chestnut opened. And the brewery itself is large enough and close enough to campus that even students who haven't been there immediately know what I'm talking about, and it really helps something click. It's a place they know, a place that's changing, and a place they have experience with that they can see reflected in this data in just a few years. St. Louis University is in the heart of a metropolitan region, and it's an area where there's been a lot of redevelopment and renewal in the last 10 to 20 years. So it makes this kind of example pretty easy here, but I think it's something that could work around a lot of universities if you find the right variable and the right census tract that's in an area that students might be familiar with. So just as a fun example, I have had patrons looking for their family in the manuscript census, as I'm sure many of you have. I've also had ones who are also interested in mapping the area that their ancestors lived in to see what it was like at the time, how it might look different today. So I used our Heritage Quest database for this one, and I looked up where Betty White lived in 1930 and 1940, which was very close together. Her family just moved right across town in Beverly Hills. She was actually born in Illinois, but in 1922, but by 1930, her family was already in LA. But looking at the 1940 population density for that area on the left and the 2017 on the right, we can really see how much that area has grown. It was already a big city at the time, right? But now we can really see both in the increased density, but also how many more census tracts there are. We know the population there has really exploded. So that this was a fun example, but you may have lots of patrons who want to do this for their own family. So that's enough with the CANS presentation. I'm going to move on to a live demo to take a closer look at some Social Explorer features. And for most of the demo, I'm going to focus on immigration and immigrant communities. So when we go into Social Explorer, I'm going to go to Dashboard. I'm already logged in. So in this dashboard, if you're logged in, you'll see over on the left, there's my maps, my reports, my stories. I'm not going to click on those now, but I just want you to remember that those are there. Those are all things that you can create and save while you're in Social Explorer. So we go ahead and click on Explore. I'm going to go in to the big overview of the U.S., and I'm going to go right into the change data in the upper left-hand side. click on that, you can see, we'll go to show all years, and you can see all the years that there's data available for, going all the way back to 1790. You'll also notice that these years are not limited to decennial census or even American Community Survey years, and that's because there is a lot more data in here than just those census products. And one nice thing is that all the variables that are available are listed here, so students don't necessarily need to know where what they're looking for is coming from. They can come in here and look through the variables to see what looks interesting to them. There's also options up at the top where we can, instead of seeing that kind of icon interface, students can go in and look through all of the different options. And there's also a place where you can save variables. So I'm going to go ahead and choose from the native foreign-born variable category and choose foreign-born. One thing that I like to point out, it's not as easy to do accidentally in this one as ones where you might be scrolling through a lot. But if you click on any given year, the 5-year estimates are at the top for the American Community Survey. If you scroll down, you're going to get into the supplemental and 1-year estimates. So if suddenly you don't have access to all the geographies you think you should, double check and see if you're in the 5-year or the 1-year. I'm going to go ahead and select foreign-born. So then we can see for the whole U.S. at the state level what the foreign-born population is. And as we hover over, it'll tell us what the numbers and the percentage are. Using your scroll wheel or double-clicking, you can zoom in, and you can see as we zoom in, it breaks us down to the county level and then even to the census tract level. But if we zoom back out, we can also do that manually so that we can see a little bit more of a granular view of what's going on in the U.S. overall. So we can change this from state to county. And when we do that, we can really get a feel for how things are. You're not really seeing the whole picture at the state level, right? Like New York seemed like it had a huge density of foreign-born population, but actually that's all concentrated around New York City. And in Texas, it's very much in the cities and along the border. And then we have this spray going up through Oklahoma and Kansas, things that we couldn't really see when we were looking at the county level. Now I need to move some of my these things around so that I can get to all the features I was going to show you. Okay, so I want to show you the visualization options before we go any further. And if we go over here and click, the default is always this shaded area, but we can also look at the same data by bubbles or by dot density. My favorite is the shaded area, but kind of depending on what you're trying to show, when you're trying to show, what the best option is can vary. We can change this color palette as well. And again, depending on what variables and what things you're trying to highlight, a different color might be better for whatever you're doing. There's also the option for the new palette, which allows you to go in and choose, put it in the hex color code number. So if you have a student who's doing a presentation, they can change the color palette to match what they're working on. Change us back to our standard. And we can also change our cut points in here. So like looking at this foreign-born population, we may want to zoom into an area that's very dense, has a lot of foreign-born population, and we might want to change these cut points so that we can see a little more detail in how it's different in different places. Like we might want to see the 90 and over, 85 to 90, 80 to 90 instead of these kind of larger cut points that are here now. One of the things that I really like to go to is this tell a story over here on the right-hand side. If you click on that, you can start a story. And if you are like me and you like to have lots of tabs open on your browser, I kind of think of this as the Social Explorer version of that, because while this really is, you can use this as a tool to create slides that can be exported as PowerPoints up here on the right-hand side, or exported as images. It's also a way to kind of go in and explore different things while keeping your like where you started from. So we can go over here on the left-hand side to these 3 dots, click on more, and duplicate. And now we have this fresh template to work with where we can always go back to where we were. So one of the things I want to show you here is something that I'm super excited about this new feature under more options. Actually, before we do this, I'm going to switch us into census tracts, which will be important in a minute. So if we go into more options, if you've used Social Explorer at all in the last 10 or so years, this Create Report probably looks really familiar. That's where you can export any data, where you can get it in tables and export it into Excel. But there's a lot of new options in here now. One that I think is really exciting is this filter areas by criteria. So if we're thinking about immigrant communities, right? And we're looking at the foreign-born population now, but really when you think about a vibrant immigrant community, it doesn't just include people who weren't born in the U.S. It probably includes second and third generation peoples who still consider themselves part of that community. And with this add a filter, we can add a filter based on any one of these variables. And when we're trying to identify those second and third generation people, it can be a little difficult kind of depending on what group we're looking for, if they are that group is counted in the ancestry variable in the census, but generally looking at the ancestry variable or in the Asian and Hispanic group variable, if it's one of those groups that you're looking for, can be a way to kind of get at those second and third generation people. So if we click on ancestry, I'm going to scroll down to, see, did I go too fast? Here we go, to West Indian. So this is basically Caribbean islands, but not including any groups that would fall into the Hispanic Latino category. So then we can go in and put, I'm going to say 20%. So we're looking to filter on 20%. We want to see where are there more, 20% or more of the population who are West Indian. So if we go ahead and click on that, it'll take a little while to load. And you can see there's not very much, right? But we can scroll into those places that there are. And we see a number of communities in Florida, mostly along this east coast here, but some up around Orlando and some little tiny ones on the west. And this one is this one's interesting because there's almost no one who lives here. But so if we click done, so what we're seeing is still we're still going to see the foreign-born population, right? The coloring that we're seeing and the numbers that show up when we hover over these areas are still the foreign-born population of this area. But the only census tracts that are showing up are census tracts where 25% or more of the people who answered that ancestry question answered it for one of the West Indian countries. And so this allows us something that might have taken us a really long time to figure out what communities might be interesting communities to focus in on and look at. We can use that filter option to really quickly and easily see what's going on there. Let's see. I lost track of what I wanted to show you next. Okay, so let's okay. So I'm going to go back to our general view again to kind of get out of this masked area. But you can see that there's a lot of things that you could use that filter by variable for, a lot of interesting things that you could see. Oh, I know what I want to show you before we leave this view. I'm going to go back to you can see why I saved this. We're going to go back to our overall view of the country. There's an option in here, and you'll see this in the main Social Explorer view as well, not just in the Tell a Story. There's the Change Map View option. And we can do this side by side, which you saw in a lot of my slides, where we can change our data to be, like if we want to look at what was maybe the foreign-born population in 1980 for the U.S. versus now. Oops, let's change back to county level. And so we get side by side here, and we can see there was a huge difference. We can also do this swipe view, which is very cool, where we can kind of move back and forth through over the whole U.S. to see how things have changed in kind of a more detailed view, which I think that's a pretty cool one. Whenever we switch back to the single view, it's going to default to the map on the left-hand side. And I'm going to go ahead and discard this story to get back to our main view. And from here, I'm going to kind of switch focus a little bit. There's a your location over here on the left-hand side, which is a way that we can zoom in to wherever you currently are. And I happen to be in St. Louis. We're still at the county level. I'm going to change our data back to just the general population and look at the census tract level. So looking back at those options that where we filtered before, the 3 lines that are in the change data box, there's options in here that you may have been hoping for a long time if you've been a Social Explorer user that are relatively new. There is now an option to mask data. So if we click on that, this is perfect for students that are focusing in on particular neighborhoods. As you might know, or you could see from the example maps in the slides, that if you're looking at neighborhood data, you're usually looking at the whole thing, right, and comparing everything around it. But with this mask map data, you can select just specific census tracts. So you can really have whoever you're creating a map for to focus in just on a particular area, not be so distracted by what is outside of that particular area. Go ahead and clear that mask. Other options in these 3 lines, this is where the annotate map options are. I mentioned it earlier when I was talking about creating your own polygons for neighborhoods. You can also do things like add an image, add a label, point lines. There's all kinds of things that you can use to annotate the map. The one that I am maybe most excited about, other than the filter areas by criteria, is the map layers option. If we click on that, you can see there's all these layers that you can add. There's a lot more in the layer library that are in here for you. Flood zones, sea level rise, all kinds of cool things. I recommend going through and picking out some to look at. But you can also now upload your own point data. So you can have a CSV file, an Excel file with address data, or longitude, latitude data in there. You can drop it in here and have the points show up on the map. That's something that I'm often helping students with, and this makes it so much easier. And once you've put anything into your map, if you're signed in, it's going to stay in here. So I have already my St. Louis school buildings list, and if I click on that, it right away shows up on my map. You can change the style of your markers, what the icon is. So I have little schools now. You can set the label. You can also have it display a pop-up. So if I want a pop-up title with the school's name and say maybe how many students are in that school, then if I hover over any of these points, can pop up with what the school name is, how many students are there. And you can see I didn't spend a lot of time cleaning up this data. A lot of it doesn't have the full names of the students, but this is a really cool thing that you can help students do, but you can also use in classes. And that brings me to the share feature up in the top here. If you click on that, you can send someone a link to this. You can email it to someone. But you can also, with this embed feature here in the middle, you can copy this embed code. And if you use the widget option in LibGuides, you can embed a specific map into a LibGuide. So if you're creating a map like this for a specific class that you want them to either do an activity with or use in the course of whether it's their library session with you or the course overall, you can embed this specific map with the, where they come in and they see the variable that you've chosen and all the points that you have in there embedded in your LibGuide, and they can go in and play with it. So I think that's a really cool feature, which most libraries are using LibGuides as their research guides. So that's a really fun thing to be able to do. And with that, I think that is all the things that I had on my list to make sure and show you. Although, wait, one other thing I want to mention is this search feature up in the upper corner here. And here you can search for really any geography, and this is where, like, if we search for Mario Logan, for example, there are some neighborhoods for some cities that will show up in here. So if you search in there, you can um, find if yours is in there. St. Louis is not in there, but you can search for particular streets in St. Louis. So like if I searched for Shaw, St. Louis, see, it's not really coming up right now. But anyway, you could search for streets in there as well. I'm going to go back to my location and see how easy that function is to use. And that was everything that I had planned to show you in the live demo. And I am happy with what time is left to answer any questions that people have.
Terrific. Very nice. Thank you very much. I have a first question. And the question is, how does this compare to free data sources, such as data.census.gov? You know, and from the Social Explorer perspective, you know, we built it to be simpler and easy to use interface. We provide fast and smooth maps, better visualization tools, better presentation and storytelling tools. But how do you see it as a librarian as well? You're familiar with
Yes.
the census tools that are available from the government. How does this compare to those?
So one thing that I would say is that the historical data is not going to be present on data.census.gov. And I do think that, unfortunately, I think mapping is something that has been difficult with a lot of the census tools. I think it's a little bit better with data.census.gov, but it's still not quite as seamless. It's definitely, I think with the new interface, it is easier to use for novices, but still not quite as easy to use as Social Explorer in some ways. And just as an example, earlier this semester, I taught a class in our biostatistics program. It's a research data management class, and I spent a whole 2-hour class period with them talking about the census and how to get census data. And I showed them both of the tools, data.census.gov as well as Social Explorer. And for a lot of them, and their instructor wanted them to really use they were using current data, and the instructor wanted them to be able to pull that data from data.census.gov and have that official data. But a lot of them didn't really, even after us talking about it for an hour, didn't really fully know everything that was in the census or have a great idea of what they might use that was applicable to their project. And Social Explorer allowed them to go in and kind of explore the variables in kind of a more direct, easy way where they could see what was going on with those variables and see what was available. And then from there, they could go to data.census.gov and actually download what they needed. So I don't see it necessarily as one being better than the other, but them being very complementary tools that even for the advanced student, they can use both of them. And then there's definitely students that I would not even try to introduce to data.census.gov. Like, I think Social Explorer is a good way to really get people interested and quickly understand why they might use census data.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I think that point about having the historical data going back to 1790 is very important. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
I have another question for you. How, in your mind, how does this compare to a GIS program? And, you know, I have my understanding of what I think, but again, as a data librarian, how do you see that in terms of comparing this to a GIS program?
Well, I think it's kind of, in some ways, it's a similar comparison, right? There's certainly things that you can do in ArcGIS or R that you can't do in Social Explorer, and but then there's a lot lower barrier to mapping and visualizing data using Social Explorer. So I have people I help using Social Explorer who are just not, like, they're not at the level where they're ready to learn GIS. Even if that's something that they are going to spend time doing, they haven't done it yet. And Social Explorer is something that will allow them to make maps and to visually see that data and what's going on with those variables, whether it's in a single year or over time. Or they could do that with GIS, but it would take them a lot longer, and they would have a lot more learning to do. And so I do use it with students who aren't going to be using those GIS tools, but even, again, kind of the same example that I talked about with that, that data management class, where I think, especially for students who are in the process of learning GIS, it can take a long time to map and to get the map the way they want it to look, and using something like Social Explorer allows them to really get an idea of what variables are going to be interesting to them, what things they might want to study and take the time to create their own maps for. And of course, there's, with your own GIS, you can bring in data from any place that you want and any kind of data, whereas Social Explorer, you are limited to what is there, and then uploading your own, being able to upload your own point data. So it just kind of depends on what you're trying to do and how quickly you're trying to do it, honestly.
Terrific, thank you. Somebody asked about the tables of the data. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the data tables that are available, but there are data tables for everything that's outlined within Social Explorer that can be downloaded. Do you use those data tables at all, Rebecca?
I do use it some, and I do. So I have a lot of students who are exporting those data tables, whether to use it as tables rather than mapping, or some who are exporting it to use in their own GIS maps. And one of the things that I do like about when you go into the doing the reports, and it's also an option in the mapping, is you may have noticed when we were looking at the variables, they have Social Explorer numbers, but you can't, at least for the ACS data, the actual census table numbers are also an option in there. So you can go in and, like, if you already know, like, well, this table, ACS table is what I was using in data.census.gov, you can go in and get that same data, that same table through Social Explorer. So it's in one of the, it was in the options that we looked at where we were choosing the variables with the pull down menu, and you can get that in the reports as well. I would say I use the Social Explorer more for the mapping feature, but often students are also exporting that data.
Terrific. Well, that brings us to the end of our questions for now. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Mark, do you have anything you'd like to say before we shut down for the day?
I would just say thank you to you, Jeff, and thank you to you, Rebecca, for the presentation. Thanks for spending some time with us today and sharing all of this really fascinating census information. I'd also like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so you can be on the lookout for a follow-up email from ACRLN Choice with a link to the recording. And also, I'm going to drop it in here real quick. We do have a quick survey that I would ask you to fill out to let us know how we did today, and you should be able to see that in your chat box. So if you could take a moment and let us know how we did, we would really appreciate that. Last thing is thanks to everybody out there today for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I hope the rest of your day is great. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.